harsh winters of the Wild West were a test of endurance. Settlers accustomed to milder climates found themselves face to face with relentless cold. Their huts, hastily built from available materials, were ill-suited to such conditions. But giving up was not in their nature. They quickly realized that survival depended on their ability to adapt and find unconventional solutions. When the temperature dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, survival was a real feat. Ice formed in the kitchen bucket and cracks creaked in the walls. How could they avoid dying overnight? It was a matter of survival, and the settlers found the answers. They were true heat engineers who used their ingenuity and experience to create a refuge from the cold. They knew how to stay warm, how to use natural materials, and how to build houses, and many of their methods still work today. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how settlers survived in conditions where the cabin was completely frozen, and how they were able to invent the warm things we still use today. The settlers quickly realized that fighting the cold on the surface of the earth was much more difficult than sheltering from it. They built dugouts and semi-dugouts. These dwellings were dug into the ground, and the roof was made of logs covered with turf and earth. The earth was an excellent insulator that helped to retain heat, but their greatest trick was the use of earth walls. The walls of the dugout were thick and dense, which prevented cold air from penetrating inside. Earthen dwellings were not just temporary housing, but a well-thought-out engineering solution. By digging their dwellings into the ground, the settlers took advantage of the natural insulating properties of the soil. At a depth of several feet, the temperature of the earth remains relatively stable throughout the year, which helped to maintain a comfortable temperature in the earthen dwelling, even when it was freezing on the surface. The roof of the dugout, made of logs, branches, and a thick layer of turf, was another element of this system. The turf, covered with earth, served as an excellent thermal barrier, protecting the dwelling from the cold above. It also helped prevent leaks during rainfall. The entrance to the dugout was often made narrow and low to minimize heat loss. Such dwellings were very effective in harsh winters, as they required a minimum amount of firewood for heating. They were what helped the pioneers survive. They were very simple but very effective. This was proof that people in that era were very inventive when it came to conserving heat. They used the materials available to them to create comfortable living conditions. What modern method of insulating a house do you think can be compared to the construction of a dugout? Share your ideas in the comments. Unlike open fireplaces, which lost heat quickly, settlers learned to build closed stone stoves. These stoves were made of large stones and clay. They had a small opening for loading firewood and a chimney. The stones heated up during the day and slowly gave off heat throughout the night. More advanced stoves had a smoke storage system. The chimney passed through a stone or clay mass that was heated by the smoke. This was very effective. The transition from an open hearth to a closed stove was a key moment in the struggle for survival. Although open fires were the center of life, they used fuel inefficiently, and most of the heat escaped through the smoke hole. A stone oven, on the other hand, accumulated heat. Its thick walls of stone or clay, which were poor conductors of heat, absorbed heat from the fire and slowly released it into the room. This provided even and long-lasting heat, which was vital in harsh winter conditions. The smoke storage system was another ingenious invention. A chimney passing through a stone mass not only removed smoke, but also transferred heat to the stones. The stones, in turn, heated up and radiated heat for a long time, even after the fire in the stove had gone out. This was very important, as it allowed the house to be kept warm throughout the night without constantly adding wood to the fire. Building such stoves required skill and knowledge. The settlers used the materials available to them: stones, clay, and sand. They learned how to mix clay and sand correctly to obtain a durable and fire-resistant material. They also learned how to lay the stones correctly to create a sturdy structure. This system was so effective that some of its elements are still used today in modern stoves and fireplaces. Ultimately, stone stoves and smoke accumulators were a real salvation for the settlers. They were what helped them survive in harsh conditions and build their lives. They were proof that people in that era were very inventive when it came to preserving heat. But even such a well-thought-out system did not save them from the freezing cold, and they had to look for warmth outside their homes. What could be a personal source of heat in conditions where even sunlight did not warm them? Watch this video to the end to find out the answer to this question. When they needed to warm up on the road, migrants used hot stones. They heated the stones in a fire, wrapped them in cloth, and put them in their pockets or under their clothes. This was very convenient, as the stones retained heat for a long time. Another trick was to use hot water. Migrants poured hot water into leather bags or bottles, wrapped them in cloth, and took them with them on the road. This was very effective. Migrants were forced to look for portable sources of heat that could be used outside the home. The simplest but most effective solution was stones. They were available everywhere, could be easily heated in a fire, and retained heat for a long time. The choice of stone was very important. Migrants preferred flat, smooth stones that were easy to carry and had no sharp edges. Hot water was another ingenious solution. It was poured into leather bags or bottles, which were then wrapped in cloth. This was very effective, as the water retained its heat for a long time. These bottles were used not only to keep warm on the road, but also to warm the bed before going to sleep. They were placed under the blanket and warmed the bed, which was very important in cold conditions. These simple but effective tricks were part of the daily life of the settlers. They were what helped them survive. They were proof that people in that era were very inventive when it came to keeping warm. They used the materials available to them to create comfortable living conditions for themselves. This is what allowed them to survive in harsh conditions and build their lives. In the deadly cold, preparing for the night was a real ritual. The settlers carried out a whole series of activities to avoid dying of cold. They plugged all the cracks in the house and closed the windows and doors. They also hung thick blankets on the windows and doors to serve as thermal barriers. They also prepared their beds. They put hot stones, hot ashes, or simply hot water in containers on the bed. All this helped to warm the bed. Preparing for the night was not just a routine, but a complex system aimed at preserving every degree of heat. The settlers knew that during the day, while the hearth was burning, the house was more or less warm. But when darkness fell, the temperature dropped, and it was necessary to slow down this process as much as possible. Plugging the cracks with moss or clay was the first step. It was similar to sealing a modern house, only without the use of expensive materials. Particular attention was paid to windows and doors, which were the main sources of heat loss. Thick blankets or even animal skins were hung on them to serve as an additional barrier. This simple but effective measure helped to keep the heat inside the house. The bed also required special attention. It was not just a place to sleep, but a real refuge. It was insulated with hot stones or ashes wrapped in cloth. This helped to keep it warm for several hours. This method was very effective, as it allowed the bed to be warmed without using a large amount of firewood. But if preparing for bed was so complicated, why didn't the settlers try to retreat to their beds? Let's talk about that right now. Sleeping together was very common in those days. People slept together not only out of necessity, but also for warmth. Sleeping together was much warmer than sleeping alone. This was especially important in cold houses without heating. Sleeping together was also a symbol of unity and trust. People who slept together were very close. It was part of their culture. They didn't see anything strange in it. The practice of sleeping together was dictated not only by the cold, but also by simple laws of physics. The heat emitted by the bodies created a kind of microclimate under the blankets, allowing the temperature to be maintained. The more bodies were close together, the more effective this process was. This was especially important when the frost penetrated even the thickest walls. This practice also had a profound social significance. In a constant struggle for survival, sleeping together was an act of trust and solidarity. It symbolized the unity of the family, where each person depended on the other. In these moments, people felt protected because they knew they were not alone. This was especially important in rural areas where bandits were common. Ultimately, sleeping together was not just a practice, but part of the culture. It was driven not only by necessity, but also by social reasons. It was what helped people survive in harsh conditions and maintain unity. This practice was so effective that it is still used today in some cultures. It is proof that settlers were very resourceful when it came to staying warm and maintaining unity. Food was very important for survival. Settlers ate a lot of fatty foods, which gave them energy. Fat was an excellent fuel for the body. They also drank hot beverages, which helped them stay warm. Hot tea, coffee, and hot milk were very popular. The settlers also ate a lot of meat, which was a rich source of fat. They also ate a lot of vegetables and fruits, which were rich in vitamins. This was very important for maintaining health. In the deadly cold, food was no longer just a way to satisfy hunger. It became a vital source of energy. The animal fat they got from meat was the most valuable. It gave the body fuel to maintain body temperature. Settlers ate lard, fatty meat, and bone marrow. This food was very high in calories and helped them stay warm. Hot drinks also played an important role. They helped to warm up quickly and lift the spirits. Tea, coffee, and milk were not just drinks, but part of a ritual. They were what helped people survive. In addition to fatty foods, settlers ate lots of vegetables and fruits, which were rich in vitamins. This was very important for maintaining health. In conditions where there were no medicines, proper nutrition was the only way to avoid getting sick. Ultimately, food was not just a source of energy, but part of a survival system. It was what helped people survive in harsh conditions. It was proof that people in that era were very inventive when it came to staying warm. But if food was the main fuel for the body, what did they use to keep warm when the firewood ran out? We'll tell you about that in a minute. Snow is an excellent insulator. Settlers quickly realized this and used snow to insulate their homes. They covered the walls and roofs with snow, which helped to keep the heat inside. Snow was also used to build temporary shelters. The settlers built snow houses, which were very warm. Snow was an excellent insulator that helped to retain heat. The settlers learned to see snow not only as an obstacle, but also as a valuable resource. They used snow as a natural insulator. By covering the walls of their huts with snow, they created an additional thermal barrier. Snow, being porous, trapped air in its crystal structures. This air layer was an excellent insulator, preventing heat from escaping from the house and cold from penetrating inside. This method was especially useful because it did not require any additional materials, only a little time and effort. In harsh winters, when firewood ran out, snow was a real lifesaver. It helped to retain heat, which was vital for survival. Snow was also used to build temporary shelters. Settlers built snow houses, which were very warm. Snow was an excellent insulator that helped to retain heat. These houses were very effective in harsh winters, as they required a minimum amount of firewood for heating. They were what helped the pioneers survive. They were very simple but very effective. This was proof that people in that era were very inventive when it came to conserving heat. They used the materials available to them to create comfortable living conditions for themselves. Light was very important for survival. It was the only source of light during the dark hours of the day. Settlers used candles, oil lamps, and fires in the fireplace to light their homes. Light was also used to boost morale. When the house was lit, people felt more comfortable. This was very important, as in the deadly cold, people could lose hope. When darkness fell, the world around the settlers became hostile and frightening. The sounds of the wild, the howling wind, all this created an atmosphere of anxiety. In these conditions, light was not just a tool, but a vital element. The fire in the fireplace, the flickering of a candle or oil lamp, created a small island of safety in the endless darkness. It was what helped people feel protected. In addition, light was a symbol of hope. It signified that life goes on, that there is warmth and comfort. It helped to combat despair and kept up morale. When the house was lit, people could go about their business, communicate with each other, and plan for the future. This was very important, as in the deadly cold, people could lose hope. Creating light was a kind of art. Settlers made candles from animal fat and wicks from cotton or linen. Oil lamps were made from clay and used animal fat or vegetable oil as fuel. This was very important because it allowed them to create light without using expensive materials. Ultimately, light was not just a tool, but part of a survival system. It was what helped people survive in harsh conditions. It was proof that people in that era were very inventive when it came to staying warm. They used the materials available to them to create comfortable living conditions. Ventilation was very important because the houses were very stuffy. The settlers made small holes in the walls, which they used for ventilation. They also opened doors and windows to air out their homes. Drafts were a big problem as they could let in cold air. Settlers used thick curtains to cover door and window openings. This helped to keep the heat inside the house. Balancing heat retention and fresh air was a difficult task for the settlers. When houses were tightly sealed to retain heat, the air inside became stuffy and humid. This could lead to unpleasant odors and stuffiness. To solve this problem, settlers made small holes in the walls which they used for ventilation. These holes were small enough to prevent too much heat from escaping, but large enough to allow air to circulate. Drafts were a big problem. They could let in cold air, making the houses even colder. To solve this problem, settlers used thick curtains to cover door and window openings. These curtains were made of thick wool or linen, which did not let cold air through. They also used moss or clay to plug gaps in doors and windows. This was very important as it allowed them to keep the heat inside the house. Ultimately, ventilation and draft prevention were part of a survival system. They were what helped people survive in harsh conditions. They were proof that people in that era were very resourceful when it came to conserving heat. They used the materials available to them to create comfortable living conditions. Settlers used not only earth and snow for insulation, but also plant materials which were abundant. They learned to use moss, straw, and dry leaves to plug gaps in walls and roofs. These materials were excellent insulators because they trapped air, which is known to be a poor conductor of heat. Another ingenious trick was the green roof. They laid turf with grass and moss on the roofs of their dugouts and semi-dugouts. This green roof was not only an additional layer of insulation, but also protected the dwelling from rain and snow. The grass and moss growing on the roof created a dense layer that prevented moisture from penetrating inside. Such methods were very effective and environmentally friendly. They did not require expensive materials, only a little time and effort. This is what helped the pioneers survive in harsh conditions. They used the materials available to them to create comfortable living conditions for themselves. This was proof that people in that era were very inventive when it came to conserving heat. They were true engineers who used their minds to solve the problems they faced. In addition to using natural materials, the pioneers used another clever trick. They coated the walls of their huts with a clay mixture to which they added straw and grass. This created a durable and warm layer that protected the house from wind and cold. This technique, known as cob, was very popular at the time. It was very effective because clay was a good insulator, and straw and grass were excellent reinforcing materials. This technology was very simple, but very effective. It did not require expensive tools or materials, just a little time and effort. This is what helped the pioneers survive. Ultimately, the settlers were not just survivors, but true innovators who used their minds to solve the problems they faced. They were the first to realize that survival required not only strength, but also intelligence. And they did everything possible to stay one step ahead of their enemies. This ingenuity was part of their culture. They saw nothing strange in it. On the contrary, they believed it was right. They were content with what they had and did not strive for more. That was what made them happy. We have come to the end of our journey through the world of survival in the Wild West, but there is still so much more to discover in history. What do you think was the most surprising thing about this system? Perhaps you were impressed by the ingenuity of the houses, or on the contrary, you did not expect night watches to be so important? Tell us about it in the comments. We've looked at how the settlers survived, but there are still many other fascinating questions beyond this topic. For example, how did they prepare food? What technologies were used for construction? Or how did they entertain themselves? Write your ideas for future videos in the comments, and we will definitely discuss the most interesting ones. And if you like this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes.